Good morning. I'm Arlie Schlanger with the LaRouche organization with your daily update for April 28th, 2021. What we're going to be discussing today is the escalation from the City of London for war with Russia and why we must move to break the special relationship, or else we're going to be headed toward a nuclear war, which is almost inevitable if these kinds of developments, which I'm going to report to you, continue. And it will be unmistakably clear that the driver for this is not the national sovereign interests of the United States, but the survival of the British Empire as a looting operation centered in the City of London using British intelligence to drag into these wars the American military-industrial complex. Now, this has to be taken seriously because it is a serious event, as was made clear by President Putin in his April 21st address to the Russian people. At that time, he identified a coup and assassination attempt against Belarus and its President Lukashenko. More information has been released in the last days from Belarusian state television that identified Michael Carpenter, a top advisor over many years to President Biden, who now heads the Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement at the University of Pennsylvania. Carpenter was a deputy defense secretary for Russia and Belarus and a top advisor to the National Security Council under Biden when Biden was the point man for Ukraine at the time of the coup in February 2014. The Belarusian television said that Carpenter was part of a network preparing for a regime change coup on May 9th, which included plans to assassinate the president. This based on evidence presented by two people that they caught who were at the center of this plot. Now, as this is occurring, the reaction from the West is to demand an escalation against Russia. Even though Putin said that this kind of behavior, including the threats from Ukraine against Crimea and the Donbas region, represent a move toward a red line which would be crossed if NATO moved into Ukraine or if Belarus government were overthrown and it was brought into NATO. They're demanding new sanctions now against Russia over charges related to an explosion in the Czech Republic in 2014. The charges were detailed in a report from Chatham House. Now remember, Chatham House is the location of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the leading British war hawk think tank, or I should say the defender of the interests of the British Empire, that was set up at the end of World War I in 1920 and created its sister organization, the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations. The Chatham House put out a report on April 23rd called "Europe Must Admit Russia is Waging War." The subhead is "The persistent lack of response from the European Union, NATO, or individual countries only convinces Russia it is free to carry out attacks across Europe with impunity." And what, we might ask, are these attacks that Russia is carrying out? They raise the question, can the Russian military exercises on the Ukraine border they describe as an act of state terror? Well, what about NATO's maneuvers, the Europe Defender 21, which are the largest maneuvers in a decade, which include states that are right on the border, the western border of Russia? As an example of Europe encouraging Russia aggression, they bring up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was agreed upon by Germany and Russia and 12 other states to provide relatively inexpensive and a secure supply of natural gas to Western Europe. How is that an act of terror from Russia? And why would canceling that flow of energy to Germany somehow deter Russia from engaging in alleged bad behavior? Now, the Chatham House report calls for going beyond sanctions. They say that Russia's non-recognition of the charges that they're engaging in malign behavior shows that they're not going to cease that aggressive behavior. So they said that because of that, it leaves the way open for the U.S. to bring in broader and deeper measures so far held in reserve. What kind of measures? Cyber warfare, assassinations, coups, all of these things are already being done by the West against Russia based on absolutely unsupported charges against the Russian nation. This was similar to an op-ed or an editorial in the April 24th Economist, which is the mouthpiece for the City of London banks originally set up by the Rothschild interests to defend British imperial interests. What the Economist said is that it's necessary to raise the cost on Russia for their bad behavior. And among the proposals they made is considering more weapons to Ukraine, bringing Ukraine into NATO, and NATO activity in the Black Sea. Now, just on the explosions in the Czech Republic, or the one explosion in the Czech Republic in 2014, the president of the Czech Republic, Zeman, said that state security found no evidence of Russian involvement in this. Now, after he made that statement, there was a move for impeachment proceedings against him by the Czech Senate. Sound familiar? This is exactly the pattern that was done against Donald Trump in the United States. Now, at the same time, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, issued a call in an interview with the Financial Times, again, British intelligence-linked paper, City of London paper, calling for including the US, the UK, and Canada in an expansion of the Normandy Four. Normandy Four was Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia to address the crisis in Ukraine, and they came up with a Minsk agreement, which the Ukrainian government has not abided by, to grant more autonomy to the Russian ethnic provinces or states of the Donbass. Instead, Zelensky called for bringing in 3 of the 5 members of the Five Eyes intelligence, US, Canada, and the United Kingdom, which are already engaged in malicious activity against Russia. Now then you have US commanders saying that it's time to declassify intelligence reports about bad Russian and Chinese behavior. Why do you need to declassify them? They're being leaked every single day. Fake reports like the Taliban bounties the Russians were supposedly paying for killing American soldiers, or the Skripal affair, or the Duma affair, where human rights agencies and British chemical weapons companies or chemical weapons centers were blaming the Russians with no evidence and suppressing the actual report in the case of Duma from OPCW whistleblowers. You talk about the lies, that Russia engaged in an unprovoked response against Ukraine, when in fact Zelensky threatened to take back Crimea and the Donbass. And the Russians said that their military exercises were pre-planned. And besides, why can't they conduct military exercises on their own territory? The one that's the side that's overstepping its rights is NATO when they're conducting military exercises in every single state in Eastern Europe. Now, with all of this going on, the leaks, the false flags, the charges, the demands for stepping up punishment of Russia, there was one example of a potential opening, this time from Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, who otherwise has been stomping around Europe demanding more sanctions against Russia. Well, he did say again the U.S. is ready for collaboration if Russia gives up its bad behavior and adopts a more predictable, stable course. Now, what that would be, I'm not sure. Putin has said he wants to have dialogue, wants to have discussion, that he would prefer that, and he said Russia has been restrained so far, but will not hesitate to act if red lines are crossed. Well, there's a possible summit that will take place in June when Biden goes to Europe for the G7 meeting in the United Kingdom and then to Brussels for a NATO meeting. Whether that's the time or not, there is a discussion ongoing. And also, there was a meeting between Russian and French diplomats who said that it's now time for supporting what President Putin called for a summit meeting of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council to take up the strategic tensions in the world. Well, that's the right way to go. If you wish to resolve these crises, you don't make threats that are based on fake intelligence, false flags, and lies. You sit down and talk, which is what Putin has been calling for. President Trump wanted to do that, but his last meeting with Putin, he was hit with a barrage of challenges, lies, and slanders that he was submitting to Putin. And we've had, since that time, a much worsening relationship with Russia and with China. So the problem here, as I pointed out, is the interference of the British. The British, who are pushing for a great reset economically to increase the power of the City of London over national economies, to eliminate or subordinate sovereign nation states to the demands of the global central banks. That's what the British Empire is pushing for with their attacks on Russia and China. Instead, it's time to end the so-called special relationship in which American military muscle, American money, and young men and women are sent into combat to defend the speculative swindles being run to keep the British financial system, which is our financial system now, to keep it alive. So end the special relationship, not the presence of human beings on the planet through war. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again tomorrow.